Today's short is being brought to you by Goya Foods. If it's Goya, it has to be good.
Your daily game plan for success. It's Sachs in the Morning. Steve Sachs.
Hi, Steve Sachs here with Sachs in the Morning. And today is Wednesday, the 28th. It's a beautiful day today. And I just felt compelled to share this story with you today. It's one of those days where I read a story and I feel like I just got to get it to you. It's a story about a man named Ian McKay, who is a quadriplegic, and he also just broke the Guinness Book of World Records, which I'll cover later in this little story. I read the story in Sports Illustrated, and it was written by a man named Joseph Bien-Khan. So I really encourage people to go to Sports Illustrated and read this whole story. So much insight, so many great quotes, and an amazing accomplishment. But you got to go and read the whole thing in Sports Illustrated. And man, how about the photos? Some amazing photos that you'll be able to discover here in this story. So back in June 4th in 2008, Ian McKay was riding his mountain bike home from work in the Santa Cruz Mountains where he lived, and he was racing down the hill as he always did. He was pushing himself at a high speed, trying to reach a new personal best. So at 38 miles per hour, he hits a patch of sand, and he flies right over the handlebars right into a tree, fractured his C3, C4, and C5 vertebrae. He couldn't feel much of his body as he lay there on the ground, and later in the hospital, his spinal cord continued to swell, and he was eventually completely paralyzed from the neck down and had to be intubated. So he called his mother, Tina, before the paralysis took his voice and told her he was, quote, hurt pretty bad, and she raced to his side where she remained for the next 3 months. Now, Tina and her husband had just retired and planned to move to Washington State, and when Ian left the hospital, that's where they headed. Ian and Tina and his stepdad, Russ, and his father, Zeke, who quit his job to move to Washington, all lived in the same house together in the woods for the next 5 years. Ian didn't speak for most of the first year after the accident. He was permanently on a ventilator, and speaking was very difficult. On top of that, the pain and crushing sadness also kept him silent. After that year, while working with an occupational therapist, Ian began to notice that he could take small breaths on his own. After much hard work and experimentation, he was able to be free of the ventilator during the day, and his world started to open up. Doctors couldn't explain how he was able to regain this ability, and it's the only real physical change he has had since the accident. So Ian started leaving the house in his durable wheelchair, equipped with a sip and puff straw, which he used to move and steer, just using his own breath. His first trip was 1/3 of a mile to his grandparents' house. Then he started exploring the 135-mile Olympic Discovery Trail that runs alongside the family's property. So Tina would get calls that his battery had run out, or that he just tipped over, or that his leg bag was full. And then she'd have to come and find him, and then he'd get back on his way again. Tina and Adam's exploring of the trails began to help him emotionally heal from the accident. He reconnected with his old friends from Santa Cruz who were still cyclists. In the past, Ian had driven the trail vehicle for some of their long biking trips. After hearing about his friends' latest adventures, Ian reached out for one of them, a guy named Josh Blaustein, in 2016, and pitched the idea of a 335-mile, 10-day bike and wheelchair trek from British Columbia to Portland, Oregon. So Blaustein jumped at the opportunity. They continued to take trips together, riding the 476 miles from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, back to Port Angeles in 13 days. On another trip, they climbed the Cascades, and they later took a 272-mile route from Brookings, Oregon to Fort Bragg, California, over the course of a week. On all of these trips, they kept the same max speed of 8.5 miles per hour, which is as fast as Ian's wheelchair could go up and down the hills. So recently, McKay began to beat the world record for most of the miles traveled in a 24-hour period by traveling over 180 miles. An amazing feat, given that he did all of it, controlling a wheelchair with just his breath. He had never before sat for more than 12 hours. He couldn't sleep, and he isn't able to regulate his own temperature. But his will to push himself to beat a record that means a lot to himself and all those who have watched him and been by his side could not be stopped. So when you talk about a guy that's just been outside all the time, been really an adventurist, right? This is a guy that depended on his body to do exactly what he wanted it to do at all times. And the outdoors was very, very important to him based on where he lived in the Santa Cruz Mountains. You know, to go from all of that to I can't even regulate my own temperature. I can't regulate my own blood pressure. The signals aren't going all the way to the brain from what my body is feeling. So, you know, he's always on high alert. I mean, this just had to be an amazing adjustment that he had to make. Obviously, more than anything physically, but can you imagine the mental strain that he had to go through to actually attain the high, attain the same satisfaction, self-satisfaction of being able to accomplish things and conquer things in this completely different state. I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing, but he was able to do it, and kudos to him. And that's my short for today. If you like what you heard, give us a positive review, subscribe, and share. Also, remember that the Sax in the Morning swag is now available on my Instagram site. Go to saxinthemorning_podcast. You'll see it right there on the Instagram, and just hit the link. Everything's there, mugs, hats, tumblers, you name it. Take advantage of it. And thanks to Al Hendrickson Toyota for their support of this podcast. And be sure to visit alhendricksontoyota.com. Toyota, let's go places.